So we're recording, so we're just going to adjust the tech a little bit. Do you? Oh, sorry. We don't have to. Okay. So, welcome. To be clear, had to change rooms at the last moment because of a pipe leak in the Chazen Museum affecting the auditorium. No artwork damaged, but this is thanks to Peggy. We're here in L160. So on behalf of the UW-Madison Department of Art History's graduate program, it's my deep pleasure and genuine honor to welcome you this evening to our annual Distinguished Alumni Lecture event. I'm Dr. Jill Cassid, Professor of Visual Studies in the Departments of Art History and Gender and Women's Studies. I serve currently as Director of Graduate Studies for our graduate program in Art History, hence why I'm here, even though I'm on a semester fellowship at Dumbarton Oaks. It's here in the Department of Art History where it's my privilege to work with and learn from a dedicated core of faculty and graduate students and an extraordinary administrative team. Our brilliant department administrator, Peggy Hacker, this welcome event's visionary organizer, graduate program coordinator, Teddy Call, and our administrative assistant and event planner extraordinaire, Jane McCarthy, without whose efforts this evening would not be possible. Our thanks go as well to the team from Audio for the Arts who are handling this recording of tonight's lecture, and please let's give them all a round of thanks. So despite the calamities of weather in sub-double digits affecting, for example, the auditorium in the Chazen, we take encouragement in being able to gather together for this special occasion and are pleased to welcome to campus visiting prospective graduate students and our honored guest this evening, Dr. Ujaan Ghosh. Please note that despite the necessary change of venue for the lecture, we're still hosting our welcome reception immediately following tonight's lecture, and please come with us just across the way to the lobby of the Chazen Museum of Art. A quick note on this key part of the graduate program in Art History's Professional Development Initiative that was initially made possible in part by special support from the UW-Madison Graduate School. The Distinguished Alumni Lecture event serves to bring prominent alumni of our program back to share their knowledge with our community. The Distinguished Alumni Lecture has the primary goals of demonstrating the relationship between the cultivation of expertise in our graduate program in art history and training for professional careers. Also providing a formalized framework for near-peer mentoring, hence the wonderful workshop offered tomorrow at noon on asking Ujaan Ghosh anything about the academic job market and what it's like to move directly into a tenure track position, and also offering opportunities to connect with our network of alumni of the graduate program. So thanks again to you all for your presence with us this evening. I know what a busy time of year this is, and at this juncture, I'm thrilled to turn the podium over to my esteemed colleague, Preeti Chopra, Professor of Visual Studies, South Asian Art and Architecture, and Director of Undergraduate Studies, who will introduce this year's distinguished alumnus, Ujaan Ghosh, who received his PhD from our graduate program in 2023 and holds the position of Assistant Professor in the Department of History of Art at Ohio State University. Thank you.
Hello and good evening, I guess, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ujaan Ghosh back to Madison. Ujaan received his PhD in art history from UW-Madison in 2023, and since then is a tenure-track assistant professor in the Department of History of Art at Ohio State University. He holds an MPhil in social science from Jadavpur University's prestigious Center for Studies in Social Sciences in Calcutta. In addition, he has an MA in history from the Presidency University, Calcutta. While he specializes in the architectural and urban history of South Asia, Ujaan is a multidisciplinary scholar whose work engages with empire, the history of religion, especially but not only Hinduism, in its cross-cultural encounters with other traditions such as Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam. At the same time, he has fluency in multiple languages apart from English: Sanskrit, Bengali, Hindi, Oriya, and Urdu, and is an excellent translator, which takes him into the world of translation, literary cultures, and poetics. Puri in eastern India, a small temple town, is the site of Ujaan's dissertation and first book project. It is a holy city. As one of the four dhams, or abodes of the gods, it is one of Hinduism's most sacred sites in the subcontinent and an important site of pilgrimage. Scholars of religion, such as Diane L. Eck, have pointed out that dhams are crucial sites where one can get closer to the divine as the gods manifest themselves here and live amongst mortals. Even though Puri is a holy city, it has long been marginal to the study of holy cities in India. Ghosh's work on Puri under British colonial Indian rule in the 19th and 20th centuries is thus an important intervention, as it brings a new sight and insights to our understanding of holy cities in India and in the global context. Although studies of Puri as a holy city have been few, images of the city and its major deity, Lord Jagannath, have been prolific, spreading across the world and receiving global attention. Lord Jagannath has given the English language a new word, Juggernaut. While acknowledging that Puri is a holy city, the strength of Ghosh's work is that it joins a new stream of scholarship that pushes against the historiography of Hindu holy cities as timeless entities by arguing, in the case of Puri, that it was both holy and thoroughly modern. The book projects reveals how this small temple town participated in the making of British imperial modernity, not as a marginal arena of interest, but as a central site, a testing ground on which the empire worked out questions of sovereignty, religion, aesthetic, and public order. Ujaan is the author of many peer-reviewed book chapters and articles that have appeared in prestigious journals such as Modern Asian Studies, History of Religions, and the Journal of South Asian Studies. I should add that he has many publications to his name from his time as a graduate student here in the Department of Art History. So it was a good time. His articles on translations, literary cultures, and poetics have been published in journals such as the International Journal of Hindu Studies and Journal of the American Academy of Religion. His recent academic translation with Amrita Chaudhary from Oriya to English, entitled Bedahisha Bilasa, The Amorous Pleasures of Ram, was published by Wide Open Window Press in 2025. It is the first English translation of Upendra Bhanja's retelling of the epic. This translation has already received high praise from senior scholars of religion. The title of Ujaan's talk is here. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Ujaan Ghosh back to Madison.
Can you hear? Okay, good. So first of all, thank you, Professor Chopra and Professor Cassidy, for that introduction. Professor Chopra, I'm really glad that you are willing to still talk about Puri after 7 years of me badgering you about the same site every day. So that's nice. And thank you so much to Teddy, Peggy, and Jane, who made this possible. I know how much work goes on into ticketing, getting the hotels and whatnot, and I really, really appreciate it, and it would never have been possible without you. Okay, so most early career academics, I am very anxious and I wrote much more than I think I can present. So if I run out of both words and breath, then I'll stop, but I'm giving myself around 40-ish minutes and we'll see where we go from there. This is a project that has developed much recently and hopefully a part of a second book project. And I'm hoping that the comments I receive from here today is going to make and be formative in that process. Okay, so the title of my talk is Empire's Small Print, Microhistories of Ruin, Rhetoric, and Revenue in Late Colonial South Asia. Keywords before we proceed. One of them that will come up again and again is Waqf. It's a Urdu Arabic word that means a tax-free Muslim endowment property in the context of South Asia. A second is AMPA, that's the Ancient Monuments Preservation Act, promulgated in 1904, and Bengal, which is a presidency in British India. Okay, so now I begin. In the winter of 1992, a group of Hindu nationalists brought down and razed this mosque known as the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya in Uttar Pradesh. They claimed that the mosque stood in the exact birthplace of the epic hero Rama from the Ramayana. The issue was galvanized further when the Bharatiya Janata Party BJP came to power electorally in 2014 and the legal wheels of the disputed case gathered momentum. In 2019, the Supreme Court expedited the case with daily hearings and delivered the verdict that the government wanted, ruling in favor of the Hindu litigants in the case. Subsequently, the construction of a new Rama temple began in the spot where the mosque stood and was completed recently. What had started as an extrajudicial assault on an Islamic structure found its legal articulation, if not sanction, from the highest court of the country. The ASI, the Archaeological Survey of India, was heavily involved in constructing the tale of an erstwhile Rama temple below the mosque in Ayodhya. No evidence of a Hindu temple has ever been discovered, and the Apex Court had also accepted the same in 2019. Since the court's decision, the Hindu right has subsequently found itself emboldened to use legal and archaeological apparatuses to dispossess other Muslim religious structures. Such efforts in the future will only like to be more aggressive from the electoral mandate that continues to favor the right-wing Hindu nationalists in India. Now, the contemporary mobilization of archaeology and law are not unprecedented, but what I argue possess a longer colonial genealogy, in which preservation regimes, classificatory practices, and bureaucratic interventions disproportionately targeted Muslim monuments and property. And in this talk, I will give you a vignette, a microhistory of everyday archaeological praxis in British India that may allow us to understand a prehistory of this Muslim persecution using law and architecture. Our story begins with the promulgation of the Ancient Monument Preservation Act, the AMPA, Act 7 of 1904, which provided the British Indian government with the apparatus to preserve the country's ancient heritage. The legislation empowered the colonial state to take rather unilateral action to dispossess existing owners of monuments of historical, archaeological, or artistic interest for better preservation. The act came through global conversations about preservation of ancient structures and ruins and was spearheaded by George Nathaniel Curzon, who was in office from 1899 to 1905, and I have given what this act says in its legal language. In the year following the act's enactment, preservation acquired a distinctly religious inflection. Regardless of its legislative intent, the operationalization of the AMPA on the ground disproportionately impacted Muslim monuments and their custodians in Bengal, which is a presidency, as I mentioned, in British India. The ways in which This legislation bore consequences on Islamic sites, I argue, operated in two interrelated registers, epistemic and punitive. In the first instance, as I argue, the Archaeological Survey of India often targeted monuments for preservations that could be used to sustain as material evidences of Islamic iconoclasm. Across multiple sites in Bengal, colonial officials repeatedly privileged Islamic monuments containing spolia, broken carvings, or reused architectural fragments from earlier Hindu structures. These selections, as I demonstrate, were often chosen because they could be made to narrate selective histories of Islamic violence on Hindu religious sites. Ironically, many standing Hindu temples, structures that might plausibly have benefited from state support, were dismissed as lacking sufficient archaeological or historical merit. The result of this new classificatory praxis, I argue, contributed to the production and curation of the past that foregrounded Islamic violence on India's history using buildings as material evidence. While destructions of religious sites was not exclusive to Islam in India's antiquity, by making only some histories legible through preservation of select monuments, the colonial state solidified a narrative of Hindu injury at the hand of Muslims. The punitive dimensions of the AMPA, as the talk will hopefully demonstrate if we have time, employed bureaucratic tactics and the language of conservation as a pretext to target Muslim religious endowments, waqfs. In particular, we follow the trials and tribulations of one endowed property, the waqf property of Bais Hazari estate, which means 22,000 of acres of land, an estate in Pandua in present-day West Bengal. Historically, this large endowed rent-free land was entrusted to genealogical custodians who were responsible for maintaining the monuments associated with the property. However, soon after the act was enacted, the colonial state accused the trustee of mismanagement of the monuments and arbitrarily declared the attached mosque as protected. When the mutawali, which is a word for trustee, resisted this official intervention, citing the state's limited jurisdiction over waqf properties, which is religious endowment lands, the government pursued legal action. With the aid of the local Muslim community, it brought a suit against the estate, which eventually dispossessed the existing mutawali and installed a magistrate, violating the existing Religious Endowment Act in British India as a temporary trustee. So what had initially started an effort as preservation led to repeated state intervention in the estate's hereditary rights, revenues, and succession disputes. So we'll start the epistemic section first. If we have time, we go to the punitive section, and I'll tell you about the mutawali who was eventually dispossessed and how the government used legal language to achieve its ends. Now, Curzon was, for what it's worth, a great builder. He patronized the Victoria Memorial in honor of Queen Victoria. This was finished shortly after her death. This is in Calcutta, the erstwhile capital of British India. Again, this is a form of architecture known as the Indo-Saracenic, which sort of uses already neoclassical elements with those cupolas, those chhatri-like domes. And again, Curzon was very heavily involved in making sure that his imperial authority is articulated through architecture. Okay, so in the first annual report of the 20th century, the superintendent of the Bengal Circle, Theodore Bloch, documented a list of monuments that he had toured between 1901 and 1902. Bloch was accompanied by P.C. Mukherjee, who joined ASI in the capacity of a draftsman. The reason for the tours, as outlined by Bloch, was to, quote, ascertain what is really worth preserving in the province, unquote. Yet this category of monuments worthy of preservation was never clarified with any amount of certainty by any colonial authority. Curzon, in his official discussion on the AMPA, stated that monuments that are likely to be visited by large numbers of people have prior claim to preservation than those in the way parts of the country. John Marshall, the Cambridge classicist, whose tenure as the Director General of the Archaeological Survey coincided with Curzon's tenure, said that he only wanted to protect national monuments of this country. Whatever it was, this vagueness of what the centralized bureaucratic authorities wanted was never materialized at the local level. And this vagueness, I argue, left provincial efforts suspended in ambiguity, with no clear criteria for what deserved to be saved and what could crumble. Let's go back to Bloch, with whom we began this section. During his tour across Bengal, Bloch came across the temple of Bokreshwar, often frequented by pilgrims due to the miraculous reputations of its hot springs. Bloch dismissed the importance of this site, noting that it was, quote, thoroughly modern structure and was built after 1755 and 1761, unquote. Altogether, the place is no more than, in Bloch's word, nothing more of local interest. Now, this, for what it's worth, Bloch was kind of right. This is a very ugly monument, and it's a very underdone monument. This is a Nagara style of architecture that was haphazardly put together and does not do justice to the Nagara temples, which achieve its verticality by using the spire and the ribbed discs on the side. But this is, of course, not its best example. But at any rate, the key term here for Bloch was that this is a place of local interest. Now, even though, in contrast, when Bloch visited the Dargah of Zafar Khan Ghazi at Triveni, which is in present-day West Bengal in Hooghly, he suggested that the government should definitely preserve and upkeep these monuments. Even though this shrine was, by Bloch's own admission, of relatively local importance, its value to Bloch lay somewhere else. Quote, the Dargah of Zafar Khan Ghazi is remarkable on the account of its showing many ancient Hindu carvings. The spoilers of Hindu temples have been largely been made to use as sources of building materials, unquote. Now, just to give you a sense, this is the Dargah. Hindus pray here, Muslims pray here. Back in the day, they used to. Now, of course, things are very different. And again, this is, you can see the images of a Hindu god, a Hindu goddess that is there within the walls. Now, this is a very minor detail for somebody to notice. But what's interesting for Bloch is that both of these sites, Bokreshwar, that not so good looking temple, and the Dargah of Zafar Khan Ghazi, are both sites of local interest, but only one of them gets selected for preservation. And what merits selection of preservation is not architectural importance or archaeological importance, but what could these buildings be made to narrate a past of the Indian subcontinent. Now, Islamic monuments containing materials from Hindu temples were privileged over extant Hindu sites, as colonial bureaucrats mobilized buildings to materialize a topology of historical memory centered around Islamic destruction. Conversely, many Islamic monuments embedded in Bengali local memory remained outside the purview of state protection until the discovery of Hindu spolia rendered them archaeologically intelligible. This is perhaps best illustrated by the biography of the fabled nine-domed mosque of Khan Jahan Ali in Masjid Kur Khulna. This is in present-day Bangladesh. Richard Eaton identifies Khan Jahan as this high-ranking officer of Turkic descent who served in the Bengal Sultanate. Numerous mosques, including the famous Sat Gambuz Mosque, tanks, and other public work projects are attributed to this patron saint of Khulna. Writing in 1871, the erstwhile magistrate and collector of Jessore, J. Westland, surmised that Khan Jahan was an influential agrarian figure with capacious landholdings who later renounced worldly affairs. According to local lore, the saint possessed supernatural powers. Chief among them was the magical excavation of a tank and a curious feat of domesticating 2 crocodiles as pets. They are still there. When the cultivation of Sundarbans, which is a forest area, was underway, the locals discovered this mosque and named this area Masjid Khod, which means digging up of a mosque. Bloch, during his visit to the site in 1901, was enchanted by the alligators, but overall remained unimpressed, recommending that the government should not spend much money on them. Even though in the following years, the Eastern Circle spent paltry sums on repairs to the tomb of Khan Jahan, the Masjid Khor Mosque was not included in the Ancient Monuments Preservation Act till 1910. In 1914, Satish Chandra Mitra, an educationist in Daulatpur College in Khulna, published his first volume of Bengali, two-volume Bengali work, History of Jasor and Khulna, Jasor Khulnar Itihash. In what was a vividly illustrated local history of the province that covered a period of over 1,000 years, Mitra gave example and attention to all the surviving mosques in this place, including the one built by Khan Jahan. Discussing the mosque, in Masjid Khur, Mitra lamented the utter dilapidation of this beautiful mosque. He wrote, "The minarets are breaking down, forests have entirely engulfed the mosque, and people are taking away bricks from its walls. When it rains, streams of waters drizzle down the columns, pooling on the floors. It is almost impossible to use the mosque during monsoon. The archaeological department have spent an enormous amount of numerous structures across the country, yet their attention has not been drawn to such a renowned mosque." One might wonder, following Mitra, why the Bengal government never deemed something as valuable as this mosque in Masjid Khur worthy of inclusion in the category of protected monuments. It was only in 1915 that the government started seriously considering including these structures and eventually included this in the AMPA. The interest in this preservation of this site came from what is called a conservation note, prepared by J.F. Blackinston, the Assistant Superintendent of the Eastern Circle. The conservation note itself is an interesting genre of prose, much of which were internally circulated amongst the colonial authorities and rarely made its way to the published annual reports of the Archaeological Survey of India. In these notes, the officials tried their best to persuade or discourage their superiors on whether or not the monument was worth preserving. It is often in these notes that the colonial ideology behind the selection of monuments was profoundly exposed. Blackinston, in his report, noted that during his visit to Masjid Khur, the mosque seemed to him as thoroughly dilapidated and entirely in ruins. Upon closer inspection, however, he found it to contain, quote, "many beautiful features," and discloses the fact that the structure as a whole is perfectly sound and without a serious crack anywhere, unquote. What is striking about Blackinston's conservation note is that at no point does he trouble himself with question of antiquity or architectural significance. Neither does he provide the slightest indication of what might have been historically the reason for this preservation. Instead, it's furnished with vacuous adjectives, beautiful niches, such as beautiful niches, handsomely carved brickwork, plain jambs, and so on, and which would virtually apply to any Sultanate era mosque in colonial Bengal, Sultanate era mosque in Bengal. The question then is, what made Blackinston interested in preserving the structure? Like Bloch before him, he too focused on one detail with particular emphasis in his report. The columns of the building, he added, quote, "were taken from some Hindu temple, and on two other of them, a chain and bell design was set, which was upside down," unquote. This fragment of iconographic detail appeared sufficient for the government to justify its preservation. Despite the fact that it faced many hurdles for securing the rights from local landholders, the state pursued a plan and preserved this mosque. And you can see this is the mihrab, which is where you pray, and you can see the sort of foliate motifs, which in colonial archaeology at this point is historically only associated with pre-Islamic architecture. Now, for the economy of space and time, I refrain from citing similar examples, and there are many. But I hope the general outline is clear. Multiple similar examples of selective preservation on the part of the colonial states populate the archive in the aftermath of the AMPA. In theory, the AMPA was designed to implement a methodological and bureaucratic and centrally controlled process of preservation. In practice, however, its working on the ground tell a very different story. The designation of monuments as archaeologically important was often arbitrary, shaped less by formal and architectural yardsticks and more by ideological prejudices embedded in the very foundations of colonial archaeology. Now, if selective classificatory logics were one way through which colonial authorities ideologically demonized Islam's place in the subcontinent, the AMPA was also used to materially dispossess Muslims of rightful possessions. In what follows, we will trace the biography of an endowed estate in rural Bengal, which encapsulates the triangulation of law, bureaucracy, and punitive action that made monuments a pretext for government intervention. Okay, we are good on time. In May 1913, the government of Bengal notified the owners of 13 monuments near the ruins of Gaur and Pandua in present-day Malda in West Bengal to enter into an agreement under Section 5 of AMPA, which allowed the government to unilaterally decide and arm twist existing owners of monuments to enter into agreements. The ruins of Gaur and Pandua historically served as a mnemonic device in the British Empire's imagination of Bengal. The antiquities of the two cities, formerly the citadel of power of the erstwhile Hindu and Muslim kings, were endlessly ruminated on by early travelers, bureaucrats, and artists during company rule. This image, which is a very famous aquatinta by Thomas and William Daniels' Oriental Scenery, which included the views of Gaur, had immortalized the spatial spectrum for imperial consumption. And this has the 101 Orientalism Linda Nochlin thing. It has those ruins which show that all these monuments are unkept. These are not being taken care by the natives, which naturally justify government intervention. So at the same time, which show the Indian and sort of both Hindu and Muslim neglect for their own built heritage, simultaneously justifying why the subcontinent needs imperial intervention. So, for the British observers, these ruins of once lavish capitals served as contradictory avenues of imperial paradox. These were at once testaments to the impermanence of prior empires that the British had inherited, while also offering comforting illusions of British permanence, who were now the guardians of these ruins. While the East India Company had allotted some funds for the repair of the monuments, it was not until the second decade of the 20th century that the government formally contemplated including them under AMPA. One of the most famous monuments, the iconic Firoz Minar, it's a very old Sultanate era mosque, Sultanate era Minar, as well as the Adina Mosque, again one of the most famous structures you will see in Bengal, along with renowned structures like the Dakhil Darwaza, were not included till 1915. Now, part of this renewed interest in preserving Gaur and Pandua came from the visit of the then governor, Thomas Carmichael. The dilapidated conditions of many of these monuments likely cast an unflattering light on the local administration's capacity for preserving monuments. Thus, the authorities, with great alacrity, notified the owner of 13 monuments to execute an agreement with the government and repair the monuments immediately. Implicitly, it was alluded that in the order that those who refuse to enter the agreement will face legal consequences. Under these circumstances, faced with virtually no choice, most owners conceded, but one of them refused. The Mutawalli, trustee of the Bais Hazari estate, Maulavi Said Abdullah Musavi, alternatively Masavi or Musavi in colonial documents, responded to the overtures of the authorities with firm resistance. He made it clear that he was neither legally nor morally bound to execute agreements with the colonial state or to carry out repairs under its direction. Musavi grounded his refusal in precedent. The entire Bais Hazari estate, he reminded the colonial authorities, has been endowed as Waqf property, rent-free endowment, by Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, whose time periods are 1728 to 1806. Through a deed, again, a deed that was renewed by the East India Company. The entire of the estate's lands were rent-free, and the conditions of the deeds vested the authority squarely on the trustee as long as he spent proceeds from the property for the performance of annual urs, or lighting of the shrines, and repairs of additional buildings according to his own choice, unquote. When the authorities received Musavi's response, they concluded that it would be impossible for them to compel him to come into an agreement. However, the collector of Malda, J.N. Roy, quietly suggested to his superiors that there existed other avenues for securing compliance. He stated that there is evidence that the Mutwali does not spend reasonable amount on the education of Muslim boys, which violates the conditions of the original deed, and could be used as a ground for instituting a separate civil suit against him. It's interesting to note that the AMPA did not allow the government to litigate on the basis of financial mismanagement. Yet the local administration mobilized the act as a pretext to justify its intervention. To that end, the collector of Malda forwarded and ordered, sorry, lost my train of thought. To that end, the collector of Malda ordered the Mutwali to furnish a certified copy of the sanad for inspection and forward it to his superior for further advice. The legal advisors of the government of Bengal interpreted the sanad or the deed quite differently. They observed that when the East India Company renewed the sanad, the phrase "according to his own choice" was entirely omitted. As it so happened, very soon the government now sought favor from local Muslim communities, especially educated Muslim communities, to go against their rural counterpart. It sought the opinion of the Malda Muhammadan Association, the MMA, a public body of Muslim men, regarding the ongoing situation. In a meeting, the association concurred that a suit is likely at the best interest of the larger Muslim community. In particular, they agreed that the estate's financial transparencies and accounts need to be subject to thorough scrutiny. While available evidence does not permit me to speculate boldly, it is plausible that the local administration played a role in encouraging the association to take course of this action. All of this culminated into the government of Bengal bringing a civil suit against Musavi. Again, the suit was not brought under AMPA, which did not allow local governments to litigate against owners of the endowed properties. And since no such clause existed, the government filed a separate civil suit, moved through the collector, and brought a suit under the Religious Endowment Act, which ordained that only interested parties and private individual groups could legally interfere in matters of religion. While the association, and this is the Malda Muhammadan Association, remained hesitant about the Mutwali's removal, the government harbored other plans. The administration added a clause to the lawsuit indicating that one of the main reasons for filing the suit was to remove the Mutwali. In court, it was argued that the present estate yields only rupees 14,471 due to poor management, and the sum could be raised to 31,000 under competent administration. The government pleader, in an accusatory tone, stated to the court that the Mutwali spends most of his time in Calcutta, fritters away the income in luxury and extravagance, unquote. Soon, things took a strange turn. While the suit was ongoing, on April 2nd of 1918, Musavi was murdered. The commissioner of the Rajshahi division, who's overlording this presidency at this provincial administrative unit, reported unceremoniously to the government of Bengal that on his way from his office, quote, at 10 p.m., an unknown person, unquote, had murdered him. Musavi also, as it happened, died without an heir, which meant that suddenly the government was in a surprising strong position in the suit to take over the endowed property. One cannot help but wonder this enormous favor that this unknown assailant did to the government of Bengal at a crucial moment in the legal battle. At any rate, after his death, the Malda Muhammadan Association met again in April 7th, 5 days after the murder, and resolved that the suit be continued and requested the court to appoint a receiver. They further suggested that till a successor was designated, the collector of Malda, J.H. Lindsay, should take over the estate on the benefit of the quote, Islamic community. Now, while it's outside the scope of the present discussion, I do want to allude to something larger. Received wisdom suggests that in the years during the First World War, 1914 to 1918, at the national level, Muslim relationships with the British underwent significant strain. Rightly, many Muslim leaders harbored suspicion against the British as they waged war against Turkey and the Caliph. Similarly, Hindu-Muslim relations in 1917 and 18 deteriorated significantly. In autumn of 1917, in Shahabad and Bihar, Bengal's neighboring state, riots broke out between the two communities on occasions of Bakr Eid. Similarly, in September 1918, another set of violent clashes was ignited between two communities in Allahabad, followed by another communal skirmish in Calcutta, resulting in several deaths and arrests of hundreds of Muslims. Yet in rural Bengal, and in this specific context, political alignments appear to have been operated through a more localized configuration of power. Here, communal solidarities were neither fixed nor predictive, as is the case here. The British officials such as Lindsay and the upper caste and class district, Hindu upper caste class district collector J.N. Roy, and a section of Muslim elite represented by the Malda Muhammadan Association collaborated to dispossess this rural Muslim figure, the Musavi. At any rate, the association's suggestion that the district court of Rajshahi appointed the collector of Malda as the receiver of the estate. What is fascinating in this story is that this appointment fundamentally violated the Section 22 of the Religious Endowment Act on which the suit was brought. The Religious Endowment Act declared that no government officer could officially serve as a receiver of religious estate. In fact, the colonial state was well aware of this legal overreach. And after the order was passed, it immediately sought legal opinion. In response, the legal advisors notified the government that it was indeed illegal for the collector to, in any form or shape, take over this estate. Yet, despite this, Lindsay continued as a receiver till the next heir was instituted. And he continued in his possession in foreseeable future till the government appointed a minor in the place of Musavi. I have another section, but I don't know how I'm doing with time.
It's a quarter past, so we could go for 5 or so more minutes, 10 minutes max.
Okay. So, now that we know all that has happened with Musavi, I think it is on us to finally understand what exactly happened. Why is this government? Nobody cares of the monuments. This is not a story of the monuments. Nobody is after the monuments. But the British government really is after something, right? So what are they after? Here, I titled this section as Speculating from the Archive. And what I'm going to do here is largely speculation, but I believe it is going to help us direct to some avenues. So how do we make sense of this disproportionate investment from the colonial state? First, we should address the obvious. As I said, none of them is about the monuments. My interpretation of looking at this archive comes from Anne Laura Stoller, who actually used to teach here in the Department of Anthropology before she went to NYU, I think. I don't know, I might be wrong, but she has a fantastic book called Along the Archival Grain, which suggests that we should not see the archive as site of extraction of knowledge, but do an ethnography of archives, which is to say that look at how people and how files are organized. Our organizational schemes in the archive tell you something about the interiorities of colonial state. So I take a cue from that. It's something that I really like, and so I want to brainstorm to see if this works or not. So as Stoller points out, that interrogating the practices that make up the unspoken order, such as rubrics and organization and its rules of placements and reference, one can reveal more about the logic and operation of colonial governments than using archives solely as extractions of data. One of the most interesting aspects of this case that I found perplexing was the sudden involvement of the Revenue Department of the Government of Bengal. The documents related to AMPA, along with all other paraphernalia, were initially housed in the miscellaneous branch of the General Department. When the Eastern Circle drafted the initial plan of the action against the Mutwali of the Bais Hazari estate under AMPA, the case and the records remained with the General Department. Shortly thereafter, once the legal suit was being brought, all the documents start going toward, all the documents were organized in the Department of Revenue. In fact, in 1918, a festooned official of the General Department complained that the documents about the incidents have been unmanageable since the paper trail shuttled between the General and the Revenue Department. Such was the prominence of the Revenue Department's involvement in the case after Musavi's death. Numerous claimants to the trusteeship of the estate repeatedly petitioned the Revenue Department. Although the Revenue Department had no legal authority to determine succession of a religious estate, it did have some involvement or give the public a sense of its involvement. Now, if the Revenue Department's involvement is any indication, one might interpret that the government's motivation lay in the political economy of the estate. Since the inception of the British rule, colonial administrators had harbored consternations toward Muslim charitable endowments. In 1793, the government of Bengal instituted the permanent settlement in hope of streamlining property ownership, which again was in hope of creating a land market and maximizing revenue collection. When the permanent settlement failed to provide all the money necessary to supplement government institutions, officials turned their gaze to a class of revenue-free lands called Lakhiraj. Lakhiraj, again, is a word that uses two Persian words, la and kharaj, which means no tax. La and kharaj means tax, so no tax. So these 10-year religious Waqf properties were called Lakhiraj properties in that they never paid taxes. Broadly, kings and nobles granted tax-free lands to religious, charitable, and educational institutions on certain conditions. The revenue from these grants were expected to maintain the institutions, support Muslim education, and so on. In the middle of the 19th century, the colonial administration, in order to maximize revenue, started retracting tax-free status of many of these Muslim endowments. The enormous loss of revenue had started festering the government, especially after the permanent settlement had failed to yield the results it wanted. Even as early as 1789, officials calculated that even at the rate of half a rent per acre, the assessments of rent-free land in Bengal would fetch an annual revenue of some 3.5 million. With this in mind, the state began resuming its tenures of Lakhiraj properties. However, resistance from local communities led to a suspension of these large-scale resumptions. In 1863, when the Religious Endowment Act was promulgated, the government yielded its position as superintendent of endowments, and all religious establishments were now placed under direct management of their own trustees. Now, when the government initially sought to compel the Mutawali to execute an agreement under the AMPA, he repeatedly emphasized that the Bais Hazari was a Lakhiraj property, and the state has no legal authority to dictate the use of its revenue. Notably, official interest in the estate had long predated AMPA. As early as 1886, the Bengal government sought to initiate legal proceedings against the Mutawali on allegations of financial mismanagement. I think I've run out of time. Okay, so I'll just conclude shortly with this idea that I think one of the reasons that there were, and this is of course one micro-history, but there are other short and small untenured lands which were primarily free of taxes. What happened with AMPA was it gave the government and monuments and legal rhetoric to target these lands, and because of most of these lands were associated with large mosques and large massive rent-free lands and associated with mosques, declaring the mosques as protected allowed governments to intervene in revenues which it had no business theologically, morally, or historically. And so this is where I think I'll stop. I hope you have liked it. I'm happy to brainstorm any questions and comments. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We're just going to open things for a few questions before heading across the street to the reception in the Chazen lobby. And thank you so much for condensing so much. We appreciate it.
Ujaan, thank you very much for this very stimulating. You talked about preservation. So one part of the selection had to do with showing that a lot of destroyed Hindu temples, destroyed by Muslims, are the ones which are then reused, and then those are the ones which the British chose to preserve. And you might say a little bit about how that feeds into the partition of Bengal in 1905 and the kind of writing of Indian history. But the other point is actually about the money, right? So it seems that why Gore, and it seems to be that they are interested in the revenues, but the revenues for Waqf are also used generally to support a structure, right? I mean, that's used for the upkeep of a structure. Now, given how, the Brits were, as they are called, often a sort of a country of shopkeepers, the documents are full of issues of money.
Yeah.
So suppose they even had to take over for other reasons, say, they would want a source for maintenance. So not coming out of their own pockets, but coming out of Waqf.
Yeah.
So it would mean both that the Waqf would pay, that money would pay for the upkeep plus give some extra.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
And it is mostly Muslim endowed property that is targeted then for other reasons as well, even though Muslims by now may also be less powerful. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
Just trying to clarify.
Yes,
so.
yes. So yes, yes, on the partition of Bengal, yes, I have definitely that's something. And the issue with the Waqf is that there are different deeds to different Waqfs. So some would say that you have to upkeep the monuments, and some would say that there is no clause. So when there is no clause, like here there was no clause, they would go after it, keep some for the upkeep of the monuments, and put the rest, all of it, for their own use. The funny thing was none of the monuments in Bais Hazari fall in any catalog of ancient monuments in Bengal that they needed to preserve. But yes, they would do some for the property, but they would always use preservation as this massive rhetoric, which is funny that it's before ASI was set up in 1861. And Mrinalini Rajagopalan makes this point, like the British were always seen as looters and plunderers, and suddenly after the ASI set up, they're like, oh, we are the only people who preserve your past, and we have that domain. So yeah. Yeah. Yes, Professor Pruitt, hi. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to run to you so that we get this on the recording well.
Hi, Ujaan. This was great. This is so rich and so much to unpack, and I have so many questions.
Yeah.
I'm gonna start with a more art, and I'm just gonna give you an art historical one.
Yes.
When you're talking about the kind of the epistemic reasons
Yes.
for the preservation of the Hindu monuments at the beginning, and you talked
Yeah.
about, in particular, they would preserve things that show evidence
Yeah.
of Muslim destruction.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm wondering if you've thought comparatively at all, because we in other areas of like kind of colonial intervention, because it's certainly a colonial narrative in the Middle East, certainly that we're preserving things you can't preserve, but also like a notion that there's like a pure point, right? That there's like one kind of essential point of whatever. So like Cairo, it's like a medieval city, and this is when it was its peak or whatever. And so those are kind of the aesthetic forms that they're interested in. So it's ideological in that they would be valuing, in this case, Hindu forms,
Yeah.
which is, to me, I think a different type of kind of way, episteme than if it's to show the destruction. So I'm wondering, like, what concrete thing are you kind of pointing to here, and maybe I've missed it, that makes it different from other kinds of colonial preferencing one period over another?
Yeah, so first things, I think that's a good point. I should probably think of it comparatively, since this is like coming out of a global project of preservation, and it would yield sort of productive results in in areas of like Cairo, there's an aesthetic thing of medieval city. Yeah, that's a point. One of the things I like about, and one of the things the part of episteme that I'm more keen to understand is that I would say, of course, this is up to debate, but I think that colonial archaeology, and since its inception with like writings of Cunningham, who was the first Director General, James Ferguson, who was not associated but was like very influential in writing about history of Indian Eastern architecture, the general stance of British Indian archaeology has been that there is something pathological about Islamic destruction, right? So Hindus had converted Buddhist shrines too, or Hindus have converted other Hindu shrines maybe, right? But those in writings of Cunningham, for example, are always seen as rational choices, eventual development of architecture, one form's dilapidating, other forms coming. But when it comes to something like Islamic destruction, it's always like a pathological hatred for icons and so on and so forth. So the Quwwatul Islam Mosque, for example, which is, fundamentally has 27 sort of Hindu and Jain temples, right? When Cunningham's writing about this, he's not seeing that as architectural reuse. It's a privilege that's there for other Hindu architectural views of Buddhist site, but it's not for Islam. And the reason for that is not something inherent. It's reason for an essentialist quality that reduces Islam as this sort of this pathological hatred. Now, of course, Cunningham is influential and does not mean that all of them are following that. But colonial archaeology has, even at this point, has this very strong bias to use material evidence to make Islam as this, pathological hatred, and it allows it to narrate these stories in much better ways. The interesting aspect is there were other Hindu temples who were petitioning at this point repeatedly for saving their dilapidated temples, right? But many of them were not included in the AMPA, and these were nobody petitioned. These were just something they were touring. And of course, this is not complete, and I'm not saying that this is exactly how it operated. There were perhaps other considerations too, but I've seen this very strongly, that whenever there was the slightest example of a Hindu spolia or a Buddhist structure in an Islamic monument, they would immediately go and save it. And if you have time for another story, I can tell another story, but I don't know. Okay, yeah, I can. yeah. But I think it's good to think comparatively. That never crossed my mind, but now I'm thinking. I think that, yeah.
We can take one last question, and then we'll have the discussion over.
Yes.
Thank you. So I guess my question is, it kind of seems like, so at one part you're discussing how the British colonial logic of preservation is focused on creating this narrative that seems to privilege Hinduism over Muslims, and I'm wondering, I guess I'm not necessarily seeing the links, why is the British Crown interested in sort of advancing that agenda? What is leading them to pursue that? How does that sort of work into their dynamics as a colonial power?
Right, so one, of course, is the British Crown is very interested in the construction of communalism. And it does through in many, many ways. But one of the ways it does through that is not necessarily about architecture is through the census. And through other legal procedures that forces people to identify as either Hindus and Muslims. And eventually these Hindus and Muslims were given separate electorates based on their population and how they identified in the census. Now, when this process is happening, the British Crown wants Hindus and Muslims to be as far away from each other as humanly possible for it to sustain its rule. But at the same time, of course, this is not to I'm not here to say there is a secular fiction that Hindus and Muslims always lived in harmony. That's not what I'm saying. Of course, there were frictions, two communities living together. There were frictions, there were moments of solidarity. But for the colonial intervention specifically, is to create an animosity discursively for its political purpose. So at the one hand, it's doing it through census and through electorates. At the other points, it's doing it through monuments to suggest and solidify this narrative. And this is also the time that Hindus and Muslims become, and especially Professor Chopra was talking about the partition of Bengal, it's a very major moment when they are really interested in crafting these two religions as binary opposites to each other, and also harboring animosity. And from here comes, your Hindu identitarian movements, your Muslim identitarian movements that are sort of subconsciously influenced by some of these colonial classificatory practices.
Well, it's clear that there's so much more to unpack,
yes.
And so thank you so much. Let's all give
Yeah.
Major applause. So we look forward to continuing the discussion across the way in the Chazen Museum lobby. Thank you all so much.